Hello and welcome to PropNext, the property podcast focused on issues that impact the future of the real estate industry. I'm your host, Gavin Morgan, and in addition to looking forward to today's and future conversations, if you'd like to know a little bit more about me, please look on www.propnext.com. That's www.propnext.com. Or if you'd like to chat privately, drop me a line on gavinrmorgan@propnext.com. That's GAVINRMORGAN@propnext.com on email. Delighted to welcome Tim Bailey, Vice President of Global Sales at Red Date Technologies, onto today's show. Tim, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
Gavin, thanks for having me on the show.
No, look, absolutely fantastic. And Tim, maybe we're heading into certainly some territory that is a little less familiar to me here. So maybe before we start with sort of questions around blockchain, and tell us a little bit about your role with Red Date, what they do and what they're trying to achieve as well, please.
Sure. So I'm in charge of the international business and operations for Red Date. So we're a software company that's headquartered here in Hong Kong, and we focus on building next generation infrastructures for internet communications and digital economies. I think we're probably best known for being the technical architect of the blockchain-based service network, or the BSN, which is a blockchain infrastructure that's designed to reduce cost and improve compatibility among all the different blockchain technologies that are floating around now.
Thank you. And Tim, of all the conversations, I mean, certainly I know we've both spoken to many people, and I've spent so much time personally trying to educate myself properly on blockchain and Web3 and what that means for us all moving forward. Metaverse, of course, as well. And I think of all the people that I've spoken with, huge compliment coming here, but I think you're the person that's come closest to completely decoding it all for me. And, you've given me a couple of great examples in the past. I mean, you've talked about the layers, or certainly layers in a comparable way with, sort of when we reach back to how the internet was set up and got established and then got acceptance. And you've also given me some great industry examples. I mean, I remember that insurance industry example that we spoke about that just explained really clearly how the ledger system works. And I wondered, in the interests of decoding for today's listeners, if you wouldn't maybe mind just talking around those two areas that were so useful to me when we spoke about them a couple of months back, please.
Of course. So maybe it's easier to give some context for what's going on in the blockchain and cryptography space more broadly. I think it's probably easier to understand what's going on right now if we go back to one of the last big global technology transitions, which was the internet, which started to go mainstream back in the early 1990s. So I want to draw a parallel to that because it's something that many people can understand and relate to. I do think, though, that there are a lot of people who are either too young, to have lived through that time or don't remember it. But if you think back to that, there were a lot of interesting things going on that have parallels to what's going on in blockchain today. First of all, back in the early 1990s, there was a lot of debate and discussion about the underlying technologies and standards of computing and the internet. At that time, there were literally dozens of different operating systems and a general lack of networking standards that made it very difficult for different computers and networks to communicate, and certainly for companies or entrepreneurs to build websites or build businesses online. So again, there was a lot of debate over those things at the time, and it wasn't until there was general agreement about common technology standards like TCP/IP and HTTP that the internet really took off, right? And again, people forget that there was a lot of debate then. And today there's a similar debate about technologies and standards for blockchain. So a lot of what you hear and see in the mainstream press is, again, related back to similar debates about internet technology and operating systems in the early 1990s.
Yeah, it's incredible how we forget how all of that was so complicated back then. It now works smoothly, and the troubles of the past are all gone. We're probably heading down a similar path again. Yep.
Right. Well, even the basic business models. I mean, I remember there was a very heated series of debates about whether advertising should be allowed on the internet, right? Because people wanted to keep it pure, and they had this idealistic notion of what the internet was. But so I think the second big thing that's interesting, and the parallel that I would make is, again, back in the early 1990s, there was this wave of business model experimentation that was largely funded by venture capital firms, but also existing businesses that wanted to incubate projects as a way to be part of this kind of internet movement. Three great examples that I can think of, having been in Silicon Valley, which was ground zero for a lot of this stuff in the early 1990s, was Cosmo.com, which did 1 hour delivery of anything into major cities in the US. And then you had Amazon, which was an online bookstore, and then you had pets.com, which was for those of you who lived through that, it was a sock puppet mascot selling pet supplies online. And all of them were experimenting that, and only one of those three is still alive today. And when you think about what Amazon does, is they do what those other two did and a whole lot more. And so it wasn't clear at the time who was going to win. And as we all know, Amazon won and is now one of the world's biggest and most successful businesses. And I think, again, there's the same type of business model experimentation going on today with blockchain technology.
Put it in those terms as well, Tim. It just makes it all the more exciting. It makes it very easy to see how exciting it's all going to be. And Tim, getting back to, I suppose, just the earlier question. So the security that blockchain promises, I mean, that's much talked about as one of the components of this system or this infrastructure. It's going to make it so attractive to so many different types of industries and entities and people. Of course, we know that Web 3.0 now brings us an internet that enables people to contract directly with one another, or at least to do it much more easily than they were able to do in previous versions of the internet. I mean, in your terms, and perhaps reaching back to that example that I talked about, how that secure contract, the security, the guaranteed security of those contracts, explain to us really the how of that, how it works, and
Sure.
why people can rely on it, please.
Sure, and maybe I'll preface that with a little bit of the layer discussion that you and I talked about earlier.
Yeah, please do.
Because I think it's really helpful, at least for me, to think of this the blockchain ecosystem in layers, right? So at that kind of core layer, you have a cloud computing infrastructure, which provides the basic computing and storage resources that power a network. So think of those as the raw resources in that ecosystem. And then the layer above that is what I call the blockchain infrastructure layer, which is what Red Date does and what we provide. And the way to think about that is like a factory where application developers can come in. It includes different blockchain building blocks and tools that makes it cheaper and easier for people to develop blockchain-based applications. And then the layer above that, you have application developers. So, there are dozens of firms as well as entrepreneurs that specialize in building software applications using blockchain technologies. And then the layer above that is businesses and consumers that interact and use the services provided by those applications. So, to your question about smart contracts,
Tim, I apologize for cutting in. So tell us where Red Date Technology sits in those layers, please.
So we sit in the blockchain infrastructure layer. Mm-hmm. So think of us as building factories that make it cheaper and easier for software developers to build blockchain applications, because we provide a lot of tools and protocols to make that easier.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry, you were heading on into the other question that I asked. Thanks.
Right. So smart contracts. So, smart contracts are one of the key building blocks of blockchain applications. So, again, in that application development layer, people are creating smart contracts, and a smart contract is a piece of software that is a self-executing contract between different parties, and it exists on a distributed blockchain network. So the software code, which is the smart contract, controls the execution of the contract, and then all the transactions that happen are trackable. So an example, the example that you and I talked about a few weeks ago, the insurance example. So think of, an agricultural insurance service where a farmer insures his or her crop against weather damage. And the smart contract that makes up that insurance policy would pay out a claim to a farmer once a set of predefined conditions were met. Like in this case, a temperature threshold for a certain fixed period of time that had been agreed upon between the farmer and the insurance organization, ahead of time. A smart contract is a piece of software that represents that policy. And, once you've agreed with the insurance agency on a trusted source of data for the, in this case, weather data, the contract self-executes. If the weather dips below a certain temperature for a certain period of time, then it automatically pays a premium and verifies that pays a claim and verifies that the farmer has paid up on their premiums. And all of that can happen without intermediaries, without any human intervention, and it's fully auditable because it all takes place transparently on a blockchain network.
Yeah. So Tim, again, I just playing that back. So that is otherwise a process where you would need to prove the weather, prove damage, probably do that from multiple sources, complete a lot of forms, perhaps contact a lot of call centers, negotiate, and then wait for a payment, all of which will be conducted in a pre-agreed automated way using pre-approved data sources that will just drive huge efficiency into from taking the policy to making a claim process, correct?
Exactly.
Tim, the other piece of this that we talked about, and apologies for probing a bit, but why is it secure? How can you sleep at night knowing that you've made your contract on blockchain in that way, rather than the piece of paper in the top drawer that so many people still rely on for this type of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are a couple things that back that up. One is, cryptography, complex cryptography and security is at the heart of blockchain technology. And so, everything that's done is securely encrypted with very complex security algorithms. The second piece of it is because these contracts live or are stored in a distributed network, not just in one central server, but they're in a distributed network that is transparent, so that anyone is able to go up and with a browser, view the transactions that take place up on this network, which and because it's distributed, it's nearly impossible to hack, because you'd have to hack literally hundreds, if not thousands, of servers at the same time to change the outcome.
Yeah. So Tim, I thought about this a lot after you and I last talked about it. So would that compare with, say, 20, 30 years ago, the difference between going to a Barnes and Noble to buy a copy of a book that you wanted to read, knowing that you could walk in, pick up the book, put it in a bag, exchange cash, walk out. You were familiar with the transaction, you had the goods, and you took them home. Instead of relying on a couple of clicks on Amazon on your web browser, where there's a picture of the book that you want, to promise that it's going to be delivered in 3 days, a system where you know your Visa card will be debited by the right amount, and the transaction happens in a fundamentally different way, but it's easier and more efficient, and you get arguably a better result. Conceptually similar, or am I trying to oversimplify?
No, I think you're right. It's conceptually similar, but you could even take it a step further, which is you don't, there's a case with Amazon where you don't actually ever have a physical book. You have one piece of hardware that you bought, in my case, a Kindle 7 years ago. It's pretty much the only thing I read books on, and I can get books instantly onto that. It's the size, it's actually smaller than a typical paperback book and lighter. So the physical book, I never purchase, right? So you can even agree with your analogy, but you can even take it a step further.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I trust it would only be an old digger like me that would miss the opportunity to present the example to you properly.
I wasn't trying to make you feel old, Gavin.
You didn't need to. I did it all on my own. So, Tim, obviously, property-oriented podcast. There's been for good reason, a conspicuous absence of property in our conversation so far today. I can think of so many different ways this could apply in real estate, and I'm going to ask you just for a few personal opinions on a few scenarios around real estate here. We on the podcast a couple of months ago, we had Sushila Rivers from DLA Piper talking about their Toko product, which is putting legal contracts into the blockchain to achieve exactly what we're talking about here. But when I look at the entire real estate, for example, the real estate transactions process, so many middlemen, it is very inefficient. It's obviously different in different places, but that is ripe in my mind. That entire process from being interested in a piece of real estate to becoming an owner, that to me should all be on the blockchain. It would be a better process for the fact that it was somewhere like that. Do you agree with that? If you do, how long do you think it will take? Technology like this tends to surprise us. How long do you think it will take before we actually see it there?
So I do agree with you generally. I would caution that and say, blockchain isn't a technology for every situation. And, I get approached, nearly every week by someone who says, hey, look, my boss just read an article in the Times about blockchain and, gave me the direction to get some blockchain into our company. So I'm talking to you. And so, you really need to first figure out, what is the business problem that you're trying to solve, right? And let's again go back to the internet example. Amazon didn't just take a physical bookstore and put it on a computer. What they did was they made the consumer experience better. So they made it easier to find a particular book title. They expanded and, provided recommendations that would likely suit you based on your previous purchase history, right? So all of that was around not replicating the old physical bookstore experience, but trying to create a better experience. So I think you need to think of it that way. And companies and entrepreneurs need to think of blockchain in that same way. Blockchain can add a lot of value in streamlining complex processes that involve multiple parties. So you need to think about what do you have that problem in your business today, and is blockchain the right tool? So in the property industry, as you mentioned, you have a number of different parties. You've got buyers, you've got sellers, you've got property managers, you've got service providers, all working together on complex transactions. And because property transactions involve significant amounts of capital, you have layers of intermediaries and lawyers in the. So I think the property industry is definitely ripe for disruption with blockchain.
Yeah, look, thanks, Tim. And, probably just drilling down a bit deeper. I mean, we're both aware of TOCO and technologies like that. Where do you think, do you have a view on where you think it impacts first in property? I mean, obviously, I've described the whole transactions chain. That's easy to say. It'll all, it's easy to bundle that up and ask, will it all get there? But are there parts of it that you think that will impact real estate first? You may not have a view on that, but I had to ask.
I think real estate asset tokenization is an area where that is happening now, and I think will very quickly become mainstream, and that kind of ties into the TOCO platform that you mentioned.
So you mean land title? You mean land title or title to real estate, sort of being tokenized and put onto the blockchain? Yep.
Correct. And I think we need to be clear here. Let's not confuse that with digital assets in the metaverse, which is a whole different show.
Indeed.
But what I'm talking about here is assets in the physical world that are tokenized, and I think there are a number of benefits to that. I think one benefit is it's easy to fractionalize an asset, right, and break say a large commercial property into small pieces, and that enables several things. You've got broader ownership opportunities. It gives owners access to liquidity. Another benefit is diversification. So an investor, even a small investor, can create a highly diversified portfolio of assets through fractionalized assets. And that, I think that's from a kind of productization standpoint. And then I think from an efficiency standpoint, tokenization enables parties to streamline a lot of processes today that are very complex, so that the tokens of these assets can include, transaction terms that have been agreed upon between buyers and sellers, and that's incorporated via software in the token itself. They can also include encoded information such as, the previous property owners, the historical sales prices that will follow the token through the life cycle. And that can eliminate costs and reduce time by cutting out intermediaries. And all of that is transparent because it's on a blockchain. So you could, for a tokenized asset, you can theoretically see, the owners of that asset from the time that it was generated to present day, and then all the transaction history as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just got to be so transformational when it bites, and it will. Tim, a large last question from me. There's no question this bites, as we just said. What are the barriers to this taking hold and really becoming, even just in the land title, the physical land title or physical asset space, the barriers to this becoming globally accepted? And is there anything that your organization's doing to facilitate this? I mean, when it becomes globally accepted, it's there. What's it going to take?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are several things. I think cost is still an issue. And that's one of the things that Red Date and the BSN, or the blockchain-based service network, was designed to tackle, which is it's still, relatively expensive for a developer to purchase cloud resources, create an environment, set that up, build an application, deploy that on a network, monitor the network, maintain it. And so we're trying to address that by building the infrastructure, the BSN that we built to make all of that much easier and more cost effective. I think so. Cost is an issue. Another issue that I think people are working on tackling is regulation. Governments tend to lag a bit in coming up with regulation to deal with new technology, and I think I'm of the view that regulation is good, and that regulation builds trust, builds transparency, and helps kind of mainstream businesses become more comfortable with technology. And so I think a lot of countries have taken steps toward providing guidance and regulation around blockchain and cryptocurrencies and digital assets in general. And I think the U.S. the Biden administration released an announcement in March around several initiatives for the U.S. government to look at regulating and providing guidance around digital assets in general. And I think a large country like the large and influential country like the U.S. doing that will have a knock-on effect in other parts of the world in building regulation. So I think cost and regulation are two important catalysts that will help prompt some secondary stuff like continued investment in the space.
Yeah, well, regulation, for good reason, mostly generally takes a little bit of time. So obviously not something that's going to be on our doorstep tomorrow, but it's coming. And, it's exciting, Tim, because I feel that, you don't get too many opportunities in a career to be doing what we're doing here even today, which is talking about a technology or really a new world that is going to fundamentally change certainly the industry that I work in. It's clearly going to change a lot of other industries too. And it's also going to be interesting looking back on this conversation, in sort of 4 or 5 years plus time to see what's happened and what's coming and how much it's developed from here. I feel confident that it's going to be significant, hugely impactful, and hopefully productive and positive too. Tim, it just leaves it for me to thank you very much for joining us on today's show. I mean, really interesting conversation about such an important issue, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have.
Right. No, great, Gavin. It was great to be here, and thank you for having me on the show. And thank you.
Thanks. That's Tim Bailey, VP and Global Sales at Red Date Technologies. Tim, have a great rest of your day, and thanks again.
Thanks, Gavin.
So that's a wrap, and it just leaves it for me to thank you very much for tuning in and listening to our conversation. And as I mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like any information or you want to have a chat, drop me a line on Gavin R. Morgan at propnext.com, GAVINRMORGAN at propnext.com. Or there's more information, as I said earlier, too, on www.propnext.com. That's www.propnx.com. I look forward to speaking with you in future podcasts, and thank you again.